There we go. And we are going to have a second session this Thursday at the same time at 4 p.m. So anyone, if you attended this session and you want to go for round two, we'll welcome you again. But I saw that we had a decent number of folks already registered for that. So spread the word if folks have questions about that. So just really briefly for the agenda today, I'm gonna, run through our agenda and review some logistical details. I'm going to talk a little bit more about developments in Congress, and I'm going to briefly review a few of what we think are our, most important priorities and issue papers to share with offices that you meet with. And those issue papers are available on our fly-in webpage. Really encourage you to check those out, to review those before your meetings. These are also designed to be shared during your meetings. So we'll have hard copies of these printed at the breakfast briefing that morning. So you can take one then, or you can print them out beforehand if you're not going to be able to attend the breakfast. But just know that if you're going to be at the breakfast, you don't need to print the issue papers. They'll be there for you. And then, after we talk about some of the issues and policy requests, I'm going to share some tips for meeting with members of Congress and their staff. And then at the very end, we'll have, some additional time for Q&A. And again, please don't be shy in asking any questions that you have. And then just a couple more plugs before we get into the agenda. Our fly-in webpage is the hub for all of this information. So if you're looking for something, that's where it is. One of the things we have on there is an RSVP option. Please, if you haven't RSVP'd, please go ahead and do that. There's a question at the very end of that RSVP document that asks to share the current meetings that you've scheduled. Some folks have also just emailed that to me, and that's really helpful. It's perfectly fine if you don't have, all of your meetings ironed out yet, or you don't have all the details. But if you can, please share that with, myself and our staff. This is really helpful for us in any follow-ups that might be required with offices. There's also a possibility that we may reach out to you to ask if it's okay for a member of our team or possibly even a member of our executive board to join one of those meetings. So if you can, please share your meeting schedule with us. If you need help scheduling meetings with any congressional offices, if you haven't heard back, or if you just have any questions related to scheduling, please reach out and let us know. We're happy to bother some folks or make some phone calls. And one final thing before we go through the run of show for the day. Folks have done a really nice job of this in the past. If you can, please take pictures after your meetings with the members of Congress and or the staff, and share those on social media, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, whatever y'all are into nowadays. It's nice to also tag those members of Congress and congressional offices. They enjoy that. And it's also just a nice way for us to increase, awareness around some of our priorities. Our fly-in webpage either has or will, by the end of the day, have some draft social media posts that you can draw from. So encourage you to go onto our fly-in webpage and check that out. All right, so I'll go into our flying agenda. So next Wednesday is our big day, and Connor, if you are able to pull up that map, that would be really helpful, just so folks can look at that while we're talking about it. But we're gonna kick things off that morning at 8 a.m. in the Hart Senate office building. So oh, perfect. If you're able to zoom in even a little bit more around Hart, that would be great. So this is a handy map of the Capitol complex. You'll see, Union Station at the top of the screen. and then the Capitol behind on the other side of those Senate office buildings. Our breakfast is going to be held in the Hart Senate office building that Connor's pointing to, room 902. That's the top floor at 8 o'clock a.m. Please note it's 8 now. We originally had it scheduled for 7:30, but there are some scheduling changes, and the earliest we can do is 8. The earliest, we've just been informed that the earliest they will let us into the building is 7:45. So if folks could, and we'll post this on the webpage too, but if folks could plan to be between 2nd and 1st Street on C Street, in front of the Hart Senate office building at 7:45, that would be great. They said they'd start letting us in at 7:45, and then our event starts at 8 a.m. So where Connor is pointing on that map is where we would like folks to gather beforehand, and that's again on C Street Northeast between 1st and 2nd Street. And then just a couple things on getting into the building. There's a door right there that's the best to enter. You don't require a staff escort. There is security to get into the building. It's really the same as an airport, except you don't need to take your shoes off. You'll send your belt, phone, wallet, keys, anything you have in your pockets or anything metal through a metal detector. And then you'll walk through and get all those things back. And then once you're inside the building, it's again room 902. So it's the top floor of that office building. It's a cool room with a cool view. We're looking forward to it. And then just to preempt a question we received a few times before, if you have a meeting, say at 8:30 or 9, that's scheduled during the breakfast briefing, please prioritize that over the breakfast briefing. You're there to meet with your members of Congress and the staff, so please feel free to leave that breakfast early if you have a meeting that you have to make. And that breakfast briefing, you're gonna hear from hopefully a few members of Congress. Acting Chief Louis Aspey is going to provide some remarks. And we're just going to have a nice breakfast, review some of our priorities and hear from those leaders before folks head out to their meetings. And then, after folks wrap up their meetings for the day, our reception is scheduled to begin at 5:30 p.m. in the Russell Senate office building. For folks that attended last year, it's the room that we had the breakfast briefing in. It's a great room, really cool, ornate. The best there at that time of day, there are doors on Delaware Avenue on the Russell to get into the Russell Senate office building that work well. You can also get to the Russell building without going outside from the Dirksen or Hart Senate office buildings if you're in there already. But there are the door on the corner of Delaware and Constitution is the closest entrance to enter to get into that room. And again, that's room 325. And really encourage you all to come, after your meetings are finished. We've invited, members of Congress and their staffs. Please feel free to extend the invite to any of the folks that you meet with that day, just to, stop by if they can for a drink, and to, celebrate our flying day with us, which should be, a fun, casual event. So I will stop there. And before I move on to, talking through some of the issues, do folks have any logistics focused questions for anything day of the fly-in? Connor, one other thing that would be helpful is if you shared that that map in the chat. That's something that we can put on the webpage too. All All right, well, we'll move on. I'll check the chat quickly. Great. Okay, so I'm gonna run through, what I think some of our bigger priorities are for this fly-in. But before that, I just want to plug one thing. NACD has had a really long track record of working with Congress on a bipartisan basis. That's a big reason we're respected and consulted by congressional leaders, across Congresses and across administrations. And it's why we've been successful in supporting, our priorities over the lifespan of the organization. So our leaders and members have been, really effective in this approach. And it's something we're, particularly emphasizing to all members this year is, please take the time and effort. Some states have more opportunities to do it than others, but, develop good relationships with members on both sides of the aisle. It's very important. I've been, again, just really impressed I've joined many, many meetings with members of Congress and staff with you all throughout the years, and folks just do a really, really nice job of being diplomatic and communicating NACD and their individual district priorities. So just want to stress the importance of bipartisanship, and that's always a big priority for NACD. So one thing, and Connor, if you could put this on the screen while we talk about it, it'd be helpful, is executive actions. Hopefully folks have received and have been able to review the weekly memos that NACD is distributed on Fridays with the most current updates on executive actions. And I've talked with a lot of you folks and really folks from all over the country, and there's a lot going on with related to the funding freezes, grant terminations, federal staff reductions, and office closures, and they're having, as you all know, extremely serious impacts on district operations, district staff, and as a whole, conservation delivery across the country. And you've heard this refrain from NACD a lot, unfortunately, but there's just still a ton of uncertainty and confusion regarding the timing of agencies reviewing programs and funding, and then when freezes for obligated funds are going to be taken back, and funding is going to be released. Folks are also aware that there's also several ongoing and recent federal court decisions that related to staffing and funding reductions that affect NRCS and all federal agencies. And it's also unclear exactly how and when agencies are going to react to these decisions. Overall, there's, again, just reiterating, there's a lot of uncertainty. We encourage folks to review the last few NACD updates that we've shared. We plan to release, another one at the end of this week. And one other thing I'll note is that our, leadership team is in constant contact with USDA folks. And it's not that we haven't asked for these updates. It's simply that the department doesn't have them. And that's not just isolated to USDA. That's really all federal agencies it's been a black box, and then it's just we don't have a lot of information regarding next steps. But with all that uncertainty, we certainly know how these executive actions have impacted districts. Hopefully folks saw the survey that NACD distributed a few weeks back. We have since issued a report, based on the feedback we received, and we received more than 400 responses now. And that's coming from 48 states and territories. It could be more. I'll have to go back and check. And we've shared this report broadly and encourage anyone on here who hasn't seen that to take a look. That's on NACD's website. And I think, that's really our main objective this fly-in is to share the immediate and the anticipated long-term impacts of these executive actions. So we know in a lot of cases that producers and districts have been left, holding the bag with a lot of signed contracts as they wait for reimbursements. Grant terminations, and the funding freezes, have created financial hardships across the country. District staff, as you all know, and unfortunately are experiencing, have been forced to terminate staff, and there have been office closures as well. And those, NRCS and other agency staff closures have had massive immediate impacts on, the availability of conservation services for producers, and the ability, of NRCS and districts to move programs and contracts forward. And the list goes on. There's just, unfortunately, a lot, a ton of negative impacts that we've seen. There are critical, watershed rehabilitation projects that are frozen. A lot of instances where contractors and technical service providers have been really badly hit because of the funding freezes and grant terminations. And then one thing that we really note in this paper, and I think it's really important for lawmakers and really everyone to understand, is it's not just those immediate impacts, as bad as they are. We also have to communicate the potential long-term impacts that these actions are causing. So that's, with these producers who, are, left holding the bag, are left, in debt after, waiting for these reimbursements. That's a loss of trust in those folks in, the conservation delivery system that you all, help to provide. And that's fewer willing participants to, participate in those programs moving forward. The recent staff reductions are also going to be really, really difficult for NRCS and for us. It's going to be really tough to get NRCS staffing levels back to where they were. Folks know that, before these executive actions and moves to reduce staff at agencies, NRCS, their top priority was to hire staff. And they really needed them to administer, particularly a lot of this new funding for conservation programs. So that's been, reducing that staff has had, really, really bad consequences on conservation delivery, and it's going to be really tough for them to rehire folks and to get additional folks interested. And then the economic impacts on communities, that's, something that has lasting consequences too. So, this issue paper that Connor has up, it really notes a lot of those, higher level impacts and concerns that we've seen from districts across the country. Really encourage you all to raise these with members of Congress. But really the most important thing you can do is to communicate the impacts on your local districts and states, the impacts on producers in your districts. That's what members of Congress and their staff are most interested in. That's what they react to best. So any local examples that you can give is what we encourage y'all to focus on. And there's NACD. We've been really involved in trying to push back against a lot of this. Our leadership, as I mentioned before, has had a lot of meetings with current and incoming USDA staff and leadership. We've sent letters requesting exemptions, letters requesting rehire and press releases encouraging rehiring staff and reinstating funding that's been frozen or terminated. And we're continuing to work with members of Congress and the administration to try to engage on this and to support locally led conservation. But So again, think this is our top priority this year. If sharing local impacts, I think is going to be the most powerful for a lot of these offices. So we encourage you to do that, and look out for additional updates from NACD later this week. So I know that that was a lot, but did want to pause here to see if folks had questions before we moved on to the next topic. And Carl asked if that is this issue paper is on the web page, and yes, all of the issue papers are posted on the web page. And yeah, really encourage folks to check those out before they go. And again, these are going to be printed at the breakfast briefing. So if you're going to be at the breakfast briefing, we'll have hard copies for you there. Any other questions before we move on here? Again, I would also just plug, I talked about the survey earlier. If folks haven't responded to that survey, we encourage you to do so. It's been really, really helpful for us to understand the, really the scope and the magnitude of the impacts here. We've also shared this with, the leaders of the Ag Committee, other members of Congress. They've asked, to be kept updated on these impacts. So please continue. If you haven't, share local impacts, and please feel free to share updates as well. All right, so I'll move into Farm Bill next. I really wish I wasn't still talking about the Farm Bill. So, Congress is still working on a Farm Bill, and I'm just going to provide a quick recap. Most folks on here are aware of our priorities and what's happened, with the development of a Farm Bill in Congress over the past few years, but just going to provide a really high-level overview. So, over the past couple years, NACD's Farm Bill Task Force and later Legislative Committee, developed and subsequently worked to advocate for our Farm Bill priorities. We have our full requests and a one-page summary of the requests that Connor has on the screen on the Fly-In webpage. So encourage folks to check those out and, reacquaint yourself with those if you haven't looked at them in a while. Our main request is still to, one, to quickly pass a farm bill. Producers and, districts and conservation partners need some certainty. We need, some of the policy updates that we've seen in the House and Senate bills. And it's just long overdue. And that's, our first thing is we need to encourage Congress to pass this as quickly as they can. And the other top request is to, as you folks are probably aware, is to integrate the remaining Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, conservation investments into the conservation title of the Farm Bill. And that provides for, a permanent increase in funding for those conservation programs that we care most about, like EQIP, CSP, and some others. So our, organization a couple years ago, developed, finalized these requests. We've had, dozens of district leaders participate in local Farm Bill listening sessions and working groups all across the country. Really appreciated, district engagement there. NACD's past president, Michael Crowder, has testified before the House Ag Committee a couple times, and really I think did a really nice job of advocating for our requests. And then we've had, at the staff level, at the NACD leadership level, we've had dozens of meetings with the House and Senate Ag Committee leaders and their staff to push for our requests, to respond to some of the language they developed. And then we've also done a lot of work through coalitions that we either lead or are, members of with with farm groups, and then with other conservation and environmental groups. So last year, the House introduced a farm bill that I guess in short, we really liked. It supported that top request of integrated that funding, and it also supported, a lot of our other priorities to do things like streamline program administration, and to make some programs a little bit more locally led. That bill was passed through the committee last year with some bipartisan support. A few Democrats voted for it, and that they just passed it through the committee. They weren't able to pass it through the whole House of Representatives. Then much later last year, the Senate released a bill, and we also like there were some minor differences in those. Even more minor if you're just looking at the conservation title. But that also supported our top request of integrating that funding, and we thought it looked good from the perspective of some of our other requests. But the two chambers, after we had a Senate bill, were not able to come together and agree on a final bill before the end of last year. So now we're, in a way back to square one. But of course, there's been some leadership changes in the House and the Senate. The House, G.T. Thompson is still the chair, and in the Senate, Senator Bozeman, who was formerly the ranking member, is now the chair. So there are Republican chairs of the House and Senate Ag committees. And they are, back to trying to develop a bill in each chamber and then, bring those together to form one bill. The one, kind of big thing that makes the timing uncertain is, and you folks have probably, read about this in the news, but the budget reconciliation bill is kind of the one big thing moving this Congress. That is, consuming the time and energy of really the Republican caucus right now, and most other things are on the back burner, including the farm bill. So the timing is really uncertain, with that and some other big legislative priorities. But committee leaders have committed to try to move a farm bill as soon as possible. Also important to note that, both the House and the Senate, have largely told us that they are, for the most part, working from the bill that the House introduced last year. And they're considering potentially some tweaks, but honestly not very many, and particularly in the conservation title. So just for your awareness, the House, they're not going to open up the committee process again to receive additional requests from stakeholders like us. But like I mentioned before, we supported the House bill. It supported a lot of our requests. So from our perspective, that's not a bad thing. And I mentioned I won't go into detail about some of the other requests within programs, but the elevator pitch version of this is that the locally led conservation delivery model, of which districts are a huge part of, works, has bipartisan support, and needs to be supported in the Farm Bill. We have bipartisan commitments from the leaders of the House and Senate Ag Committee that they are committed to that. So that's positive. It's tough with all these executive orders seem to run a little contrary to that, but we do have strong support within Congress. Avoiding one-size-fits-all policies and additional national carve-outs within programs is a priority. And then, like I mentioned before, there are we feel some opportunities to streamline and simplify some program administration and to leave some of the decision making and administration to entities like local working groups and districts. So I mentioned that the House bill includes some tweaks within programs that we think will do just that. But those are really the kind of a very brief summary of our Farm Bill requests. Again, the full request, it's about a 6-page document, is on our website, and then that 1-pager is also there too. So I'm going to stop there on Farm Bill. But certainly welcome if folks have questions or comments to please feel free to ask.
If I could, this is Chuck Rao, president of Minnesota MASWCD. When you were just talking there, I just put a note in the chat room as you're talking about the local led delivery. I would emphasize, particularly if you're talking to the Republicans on the Hill, the efficiency of our locally led delivery systems. That is a word that will that will hit them well, I believe, and for anybody. But efficiency is the big buzzword right now, and our locally led. The reason people love us is because our locally led delivery is effective and it's efficient.
Completely agree. And yeah, I think it would be great to stress the efficiency part of it. That's something that definitely has bipartisan support, but is a stated priority, particularly for the Republican leadership of the ag committees. All right. The next thing I wanted to talk about was appropriations legislation. So, unfortunately, like the Farm Bill, the passage of annual funding bills, these are called appropriations bills, have also been delayed. And, we've increasingly seen that continuing resolutions have been used to provide temporary funding because the appropriations committees in Congress can't agree on funding levels for agencies in a timely manner. Folks, might be aware this past Friday, Congress passed a continuing resolution that extends current levels of funding until September, the end of September, until the end of the fiscal year. So that's a long-term CR. And just for folks' awareness, again, a CR, a continuing resolution, is just an extension of current levels of funding. It's a temporary measure that Congress uses when they can't agree on those appropriations bills. So, NACD and really most folks are pretty critical of that Congress isn't able to, do their job and pass these funding bills on time. That's a really, uh, important part of their job. So now Congress is preparing to develop fiscal year 2026 appropriations bills for the next fiscal year. As in past years, our most important request is to provide strong funding for conservation operations within NRCS. And NACD is again asking for $1.2 billion to support that request. I guess just to give you some context, the most recent appropriate amount is about 915 million. So a little bit lower than that level that we're asking for. This conservation operations funding it's more than 90% of it directly goes to conservation technical assistance within our NRCS, and that allows them to hire and train local staff. It facilitates conservation planning and ultimately provides the technical assistance that's needed to administer programs like EQIP, CSP, RCPP, all those other conservation programs that we care most about. Last year, NACD led a letter to the congressional leadership and the Appropriations Committee supporting that amount. We had a really strong group of organizations that signed, including some some farm groups. We are leading that letter again this year and hope to have another good showing. One thing to note, and folks are probably aware of this, this upcoming appropriations cycle is going to be really difficult. There's a big focus, as folks know, within the administration and within Congress on reducing budgets, on reducing the overall deficit. So there's going to be a lot of pushback to requests to increase funding for some accounts. I think we have a really good argument for why this is needed. There is a huge backlog um, in demand for producers to participate in these programs, and a huge part of them being able to get program funding and conservation out the door and on the ground is this CTA funding. So again, NACD is going to lead kind of the charge among national groups on this, but in the appropriation space, we recommend that being your top priority is increased funding for conservation operations. We have additional appropriations requests, in that issue paper. Watershed and flood prevention operations, really important for districts, watershed rehabilitation, state and private forestry, and then within EPA, Section 319 9-point source pollution control grant program. That is really heavily utilized by districts, and they do a really good job on those projects. They're really important. So those are a few additional programs and accounts that we'd recommend you raising. As I mentioned before, for these and really for all the issue papers, try to tie these back to what you have at the local level. If y'all are managing, a watershed projects that, takes that you partner with NRCS on, or you have one of these 319 grants through EPA, folks want to hear, which ones are being used in their state, in their districts. So we encourage you all to share those. Any questions on the appropriations issue papers before we move on? And sorry, I just pulled up the chat, and Leanna had a question. What role will the legislative branch have related to the executive branch reduction in force reorganization plans? This is referring to a memo that the administration sent to all federal agencies, including USDA, that directed them to develop and submit plans to the administration on how they are going to substantially reduce their workforce, their office footprint, and their overall budgets. In order to save money. NACD submitted a letter to USDA with some suggestions and comments as they work to develop this plan for the administration. And I can, Connor, if you're able to share that in the chat, that would be helpful. But I think Leanne's asking, how that ties into, maybe this fly-in and how we communicate things like that to members of Congress. I think really the most important thing is to communicate the local impacts. Unfortunately, we have a lot of pretty bad ones to share, and just the impacts that all of these executive actions, including these reductions within, in NRCS and other USDA staff, and within district staff, is having on conservation delivery, the impact it's having on producers. So I think just making that clear, you're more than welcome to share that letter with folks. But I think just having, communicating those local impacts and and is most important. Any additional questions before we move on here? Another thing in this, Leanne had, I'm sorry, folks, Leanne had one more question. Yeah, so the final appropriations for FY25 has not been determined because there is like I mentioned before, that continuing resolution that for this current fiscal year, FY25, FY24 funding was just extended. They never passed a final bill. But in FY24, I think I mentioned it was about 915 million for conservation operations. That was the total amount Congress appropriated for that account. And again, we're asking for 1.2 billion. I did want to run through, some frequently asked questions and then provide some just suggestions generally on meeting with members of Congress and their staff. One thing that I think is really important to note, meeting with the members themselves is always great. Being able to establish relationships with them and get to know them on a personal level is I think really beneficial for you all and for districts overall. But meeting with their staff is equally as important. I worked in a congressional office for several years, and members have so much on their plate across so many different issue areas that they largely rely on recommendations from their staff. So please provide the staff just as much attention as you provide, the members themselves. They're often the ones, even when they look really young and maybe inexperienced, that they're the ones that are making a lot of these decisions on behalf of the office and the senator. So please make sure you prioritize, establishing relationships with them. Another thing, in some cases, some of those staffers, or even, in a lot of cases, the member themselves, they may not know what a conservation district is. They might not know a lot about USDA conservation programs, or just really about the important work that you all do in your states. So I would recommend just really briefly describing it if you are getting that sense or know that you can just ask them if they're familiar with districts, but just briefly describe what a district is, what you do, and why you're important in your local communities. And I think this group, that's one of the easiest sells in the world. You're all doing, really great, important work in your local communities and having a really big impact on producers and environmental quality at the local level. And I just again would stress just that quick background on what a district is. If you can do that in 5 minutes, that's great. And then for folks, particularly for those folks that don't have a lot of background, just simple, clear messaging is important. If you're talking to folks and that some of what you're saying is going a little bit over their head, just try to keep it as simple as possible, and then again try to tie it back to local examples. These issue papers, again, really encourage you to leave those with the offices. So take several of each at the breakfast if you can. That has our team's email at the bottom of each. So if they have questions, they can reach out to us. If they ask you a question about NACD's priorities or just anything that you don't know the answer to, just tell them to to call or email me, and our team's very happy to touch base with them. Chuck, I see that you have a question.
Yeah, what you just talked about, whenever I'm talking to either a state or a federal legislator, I assume they do not know about the work we do. Most of them don't. I think that's a fair assumption. I think your point is good. Ask them what they know about it. And if they say nothing, you can explain it. If they say yes, they do, then I would lead with, then you know that we do this, 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 and this, because they really don't know what we do. And always make sure you're explaining the significance and and the unique value that we bring in every meeting. Even if they say they know, they probably are sketchy at best, my experience.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And then just a couple other things, if you don't, and this gonna have the same direction as before, but if you get asked a question that you don't know, there's no please, that's what you need to communicate to staff or a member that asks. And the best answer is, hey, I don't know, but I'm really happy to get back to you on an answer. If it's a policy question or anything else, reach out to our team. It's really helpful for us to know what these folks are asking, and then we'll be able to help you get back to them with an answer quickly. And then the last thing I'll plug is, and I said this before too, but if our comms team is on, they will be happy that I'm saying it again, is please take pictures with your members of Congress. Those folks love that. Take pictures with the staff that you meet with. And if they have hashtags, um, feel free to, put those in your posts. And then, like I said earlier, our comms team has, draft posts, and I know that they have hashtags that we'll be able to use too. So really encourage you all to do that. Helps get the message out there. Leanne, see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, Chris, my number one priority, I've always said, other groups and ag groups especially will come in and talk about EQIP or the specific programs. For me, it's always about the CTA, the Conservation Technical Assistance. So that's why I was kind of asking about, what's previously been funded, because I can throw out the 1.2 and Congress is going to say, yeah, but I need to reduce the, workforce anywhere from, 10, 20, 40%, whatever it is. And that's what I want to avoid. So what I'm getting at is there any other ag groups that have been really strong on the CTA besides NACD and soil and water conservation districts? I really want to hit that home. And I always think it comes from us, but we're also going to be perceived as more government. And I'm going to, again, that's why I'm trying to hit the farmer, the landowner, how this helps their communities. But I'm really trying to figure out, is there any specific Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, National Corn, Soybean, whatever it might be, is there a group that's really hitting hard on the CTA assistance? Because that's the lifeblood of NACD's delivery,
Yeah, that
or
is
NRCS's delivery, sorry.
that's a really good question, and appreciate that that's going to be your main priority when you're meeting with folks. I'd say that I think it was about four of the major commodity groups signed our letter last year asking for 1.2 billion. Connor, if you're able to put that letter in the chat too, that would be helpful. So bottom line, yes, we do have, strong support from conservation groups, like us that are more moderate and have good relationships with Republicans, but there's also that support from the broader ag community. I think wheat growers, corn and soy were among the three that signed our letter last year. And like I said earlier, we're hoping that they'll sign again this year. And I think one of the bigger points to make on that is yeah, it's hard to when a lot of these members' priorities is to cut funding, it's sometimes tough to ask for an increase. I think our most simple and best argument there is that the demand is there. And you know, there's just a big demand for this technical assistance to get those practices on the ground and to get that program funding out the door. So those are two things I'd say in response to that, but really appreciate it, Leanne. And Gary, see that you have the floor.
Thank you. And I appreciate everybody being on here today. I really appreciate our government affairs team of putting this together. I look forward to next week. It's going to be a fun week. It's going to be a fun time on the Hill. It always is a good time to see these members and I'll reiterate, the staff are just as important as the members. Chris mentioned that. Pete and I was talking about some of this earlier today, Pete Hunter from Mississippi, and one of the things that this administration is focusing real heavily on is production agriculture. So Leanne, I think, you know, as y'all make your visits to the Hill, allow some of your producers, some of your farmers that are in production agriculture, you know, let them share the importance of conservation, have them share the importance of the different CTA money and the EQIP money, CSP money, and the other. I think coming from a producer is going to mean very much more so today than it has ever been, especially with this administration. They are really production ag focused. Look forward to seeing each of you. I do appreciate the government affairs team putting this together. I think it's been a good presentation. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to the comms team. We've got a great group within NACD. Last thing, and I don't want to really end on a negative comment, but I guess somewhat, let's try to be very, very positive as best as we can. I know production ag right now is really having a lot of issues. I know there are things that have occurred with this administration. We've had employees within our partnership that's been terminated. There are people that have been put on leave without pay throughout some of our local conservation association groups. But I think that the key is don't go in bad mouthing anybody or anything. We've already received some feedback on some of our press releases about trying to be more positive. And so I would just encourage you, be as positive as you can, but be as focused and driven as you can. Conservation matters as much today as it did 80 years ago. And we got to make sure that they understand who we are and what we do. Chuck mentioned that a couple of times. We've got to tell our story more today than we ever have as to who we are, what we do, and the fact that we've been doing this successfully for 80 years. We're not the new kid on the block. We're not somebody that's just showed up and over those last 4 years and are talking about conservation. We've been doing this, like I said, for 80 years. So look forward to seeing everybody. I appreciate all of the ones that are coming. I think we're going to, you know, we're hearing more and more. We may have a record attendance at our fly-in, and I think that's going to be great for locally led, incentive-based conservation that we've been doing for many, many years. So thank you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Gary. And yeah, I think that's really sound advice. And, you know, just to tie it back to, you know, NACD being a strong bipartisan organization, you know, we've been around since the Dust Bowl, and we've been, you know, successful in supporting locally led conservation and our priorities, largely because, you know, we don't, you know, our mission and our priorities don't shift with changes in Congress and with the administration. We have very strong relationships with folks on both sides of the aisle, and that's something that we're going to continue working on a bipartisan basis to support our priorities. So I think that's really good advice from Gary. All right, those were really the last of the tips and tricks I wanted to share, but did want to provide folks an opportunity to ask any additional questions before we wrap up here.
Hey, Chris, I wanted to just throw in a couple of things since Gary and I both have been many trips to DC. He way more than I have, but one couple of things that we do in Mississippi is one, we kind of split up our bullet points between our people that go see our congressman, so you can kind of learn them and not, the worst thing in the world to do is just sit there and read out things. And if you're conscious of what you're asking for, I can sit there and look them straight in the eye and tell them what we're looking for. It helps out a lot. And so it makes it easier for us to split our bullet points between some of us and each give a report on that. And myself being a producer, I tend to stick towards the producer side of everything. Another thing is maybe to have an iPad with just a couple of conservation practices on. I have a great picture of dust blowing across my neighbor's field right next to my field with cover crop in it, that really gets your attention, that draws your attention. The other thing is we do at Mississippi that we usually try to set up a dinner with our staffers that night. Allow everybody to go to the reception and have a good time, and then maybe meet at a restaurant later on and have dinner with our staffers and really get to know them. If you hunt with somebody, if you eat with somebody, you get to know somebody. And so that we've done that for many years, and it's been highly successful, and it gets us all on a first name basis. So without talking about that anymore, that's a couple of suggestions that I had.
Really appreciate that, Pete. I think that's fantastic advice. Establishing those, more personal relationships is really good for, future engagement with those, with the staff, with the offices, and invite them to have a drink at our reception. Everyone that you meet with that day. We have a nice big room, and we'd love for them to stop by. But I think all of those are really good suggestions, Pete. You all have better suggestions than I do. Does anyone else have any any words of wisdom to share?
One last point too, we brought this up before, Chris, but if you're not able to meet with your congressman or your staff in Washington, then make sure you reach out to your staff that are based in your state. You might not be able to catch them in their Washington office, but those state-based people are always there, and they have to be attentive because you're calling from your own state. So even if the Washington visits don't work out, your state-based staff can also be very attentive, and they can get word directly to your congressman or senator, whatever's needed. Just that's a fallback. That's not the purpose of this fly-in, but it is a fallback. Or if somebody suddenly has an appointment right when your appointment was, and they had to run back to the floor and you miss them, you still have your state-based representatives that you can touch base with.
Really appreciate that, Carl. That also reminded me, and we have this posted on that fly-in webpage too. I assume most folks on here are planning to, attend the fly-in in person. If you, and feel free to share this message. If you can't attend, if something happens where, travel gets messed up, still, offer a virtual meeting with these folks. And it's also a good idea, after you have these in-person meetings with them next week, keep in touch with them. You know, we don't just want to reach out to ask for something. You know, just sharing information, and that makes it easier to, you know, helps build that relationship and you know, it makes things easier when you do have, you know, something more pressing to share. So keep that in mind too, for afterwards. Any final questions or comments before we conclude things here? Well, folks, really appreciate the time. I think this has been a great discussion. If folks have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Connor. But really excited for next week. Think we're going to have a really great turnout, as folks have said, and really excited and looking forward to it. Thank you all.